Hey, common scientists. This week we're coming to you with the topic of urbanization. Now, this episode will probably have some twists and turns as we talk about some history of urbanization, how we've gotten to the point where we're at today, as well as some of our thoughts in general on urbanization. What does it mean to have an urban center nearby and maybe kind of further away? So I want to start off with a preface. We are common scientists. This means that we bring our own research to the table, we refine, we ask questions, and we discover together about what it means to be a common scientist and today in the space of urbanization. So I want to kick it off with now a question for the boys. I'm curious if you guys consider yourselves to have lived primarily in urban centers or not.
Ooh. Do you want to start on that one, Jay?
Sure, definitely. I definitely feel as though I have been like a city slicker my entire life.
Yeah.
I spent some time in St. James, which is not too far from Rochester, where we're recording right now, on living the farm life. And I also spent some time as a kid in Cabot, Arkansas, that's definitely not any sort of metropolis or anything, but St. James is still pretty close to the Twin Cities, and Cabot is still like a city, even though I did spend a lot of time on a farm out there as well. But even when then still, it was still like they could tell by the way I talked and acted and thought, and the things that I was surprised about, the things that I was used to having access to and was utterly, lost without. But yeah, down in Arkansas, they definitely made me feel like an urbanite for sure.
So when you say you spent time, are you talking years of your life? Are you talking months, weeks?
Yeah, so I spent so there was years where I spent summers in Arkansas, in Cabot, Arkansas. And then even when you go to Little Rock, it's kind of like, it's a city, but it's like, okay, like,
yeah,
it's a different world down there. And this was obviously, I was a kid, so a long time ago, 15 years ago or so. And then St. James would be just like, I had family down there, so like here and there we go down there and just kind of experience like a whole new world for us.
Yeah, but the rest of the year you were in the metro area.
Yeah, east side of St. Paul.
Yeah. Okay, what about you, Aiden?
I'm just quick curious, Dre, before I go into my response. You said that you were tipped off as an urbanite. What sorts of signs were you given off?
Yeah, I think kind of like I alluded to is a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? But just like the access to things. There's just things that like driving 30 minutes to get to certain stores, not having certain stores anywhere within like 2 hours. Like, there's one to Arkansas or whatever, or a Little Rock, things like that, where I just was completely out of my element, spending like tons of time just outdoors, like kind of doing nothing really to do. Unlike in the cities, it's like I was always playing basketball at this community center or in this program, or doing this or doing that, or going to like a vertical endeavors or something like that. But down there it was just like, oh, we gotta go find something to do. And I was just like, all right. Very cool.
That's too funny, man. Yeah, I can relate to that in my experience within both spheres somewhat. So I grew up, my family traveled around a bit when I was little, but then from like 10 onwards, we lived in Grant Township, and I went to Matamata High School, which is a very suburban high school. And so most of the other people that I went to school with, and Dre also went to school with, were very suburban, like the kind of classic Minnesotan suburbia where there's the athletics, the grocery stores within like a 10-minute drive, just like on the urban edges. But then Grant Township is a little bit kind of in an intriguing space because the minimum acreage, or the minimum number of acres that a property can be within Grant, I think, is 5. So it's definitely more spread out, and it's like, so it's right on kind of the like there's suburban is the definition of kind of in between urban and outside of urban, like rural, but I'm not sure if there's a term for kind of in between suburban and rural, because that's kind of where Grant Township lied. Yeah, so there was a lot of horse farms nearby, or regular farms nearby, like in my back, like right behind my parents' home. There's a farmer who grew corn and all these things. Yet I went to a very suburban high school and had a lot of those experiences too. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how I'd classify myself. I think today I'd definitely say much more urban. Like I'm much more excited about the urban experience, and we're moving. So Lauren and I are moving to Minneapolis soon. So yeah, very excited for that.
Definitely, yeah, that is definitely an interesting perspective that I never really considered growing up so close to, like, obviously spending a lot of my childhood in Matamidi, but then being close to Grant Township as well. And I had no idea that that was a requirement of the acreage. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think so. The county too that we live in has the most horses per capita of any county, at least in Minnesota, if not the nation. So
Whoa.
it's like, yeah, it's this weird kind of space where it's like, yeah, we're definitely in suburbia in a lot of ways, where there's a lot of the like grocery stores and things like that and amenities nearby, but there's also like big tracts of land. And yeah, so it's a weird kind of space.
Yeah, I don't know if I should say I have you guys beat or like exactly what, but I grew up in, well, it's a little complicated, the property line of our house, like what decides one town versus the other town, goes about straight through our house. So our address was for Frazee, Minnesota, F-R-A-Z-E. A lot of people are like, oh, that's Frazee. I'm like, no, it's Frazee. Anyways, the population of Frazee is 1,340 people.
That's small.
And the town that I actually would consider it more accurate to where I lived, which was even closer, so the center of that town was only 4 miles from my house, was Vergas, Minnesota. And Vergas, Minnesota, which is what, while it's not our official address, is probably where I consider to be my hometown in a lot of ways, has a population of 358. So I grew up in an isolated, it's like literally that's the definition, is like less than some number that both those numbers are below. So an isolated population. So the nearest Walmart, because that's, I guess, a cultural reference that I think most people get, was, I think, like 35 miles away or 40 miles away, something like that, from my address. And I drove also 35 miles to go to school in a neighboring community that was a little bigger, Perham, Minnesota, with a population of around 3,400. So all of those, though, quite rural, and some of them isolated. So for my mom, for all of her C-sections, she had to drive to the nearest hospital that could handle the complexity of her care, because she had 5 biological children, and so she had to drive about an hour to Fargo, North Dakota, the nearest metro area, which isn't even in Minnesota, right? So the metro area that I grew up knowing was Fargo, which is in North Dakota. So when I think of urbanization or urban centers, it's funny to hear you guys like, oh, I lived in Grant Township and it had horses and 5 acres and also I'm sure there was a super Target within 15 minutes of you or something. So it's funny to hear like your understanding, because growing up I knew of the Twin Cities is what I knew it as, and still am like struggling to think about it differently than that. But I knew of the Twin Cities as just this big metro, like huge area, and it didn't matter at all which, like whether it was Stillwater or Minneapolis or St. Paul or whatever, Matamidi, like all of it to me was the Twin Cities. So I used to think it was so hilarious, and still am learning that the culture within the city can be so different in just like these small towns when you just cross some arbitrary line.
Yeah, that's super apt. I mean, yeah, just a completely different experience growing up, and also just a super apt observation is just the heterogeneity, and that sounds like a big word, but it just means that the diversity of cities is huge. There is a lot to. I like to. I mean, it's kind of funny. I always say the cities. So we are from Minnesota and live in Minnesota, and the two large metro areas are St. Paul and Minneapolis. So a lot of people from other places where there's the one big city, it just sounds strange to my ears, because culturally I just grew up saying the cities. If you're outside of Chicago, it's the city, right? Singular. But for me, with the cities, there's a lot of diversity in terms of the socioeconomic statuses of different parts of the cities, as well as the natural environments. So it's just, that just made me think a little bit.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think part of the reason that I thought of this cast idea is because of moving soon to now what's really truly a metropolitan area, the Minneapolis, St. Paul type community, and all of the neighboring, I don't know if you would call them all suburban. Some of them certainly seem urban to me, but I climbed in population to Rochester, Minnesota, which has a population of 115,000 when I went to college. It was the first time I ever parked in a parking ramp. It was the first time I ever got a parking ticket for parking in a parking ramp. And now to Minneapolis, which has a population of 420,000. So from 358, I've really moved up in population.
In population numbers. Wow.
Yeah. Does that make you guys think or feel anything?
One thing it makes me think of is there's this mathematical principle called the Pareto Principle, where about 20% of the input of something tends to have 80% of the effects. And it applies to a lot of different things. And one of the things are one example would be 20% of the people in a nation tend to produce 80% of the GDP. It's also been applied to in business, trying to find out what are the most high reward activities. Like 20% of the activities have 80% of the output. One thing with population is in cities, it tends to also follow that distribution. So 20% of the cities tend to have 80% of the people. So like as far as the rise in population, it can be just I don't know how it's just exponential as far as you grow in city size. So the differences are huge between, like you said, most of these small tiny towns and big metropolitan areas, and the cities too are not even like a big one compared to other ones globally. You got Mexico City and Tokyo, which has just I think 40 million. I'm also just pulling that number out of my butt. So do your common science research and figure out what the population of Tokyo is, because it is just extraordinary.
Yeah, no, it's funny you say that, because I'm literally looking at a graph that looks quite exponential. I don't know if you guys can kind of see that. We'll post it or link it so that you guys, listeners, could pull it up if you want to. But it looks quite exponential, or at the very least very linear, with a lot of growth between 1900s and 2040 in the Minnesota's population distribution. So certainly we're seeing more urbanization in Minnesota, and worldwide that's also been a trend. But I want to dive into the word urbanization, because we talked a little bit about urban centers and our own evolution of urbanism within our lives. We haven't really talked about what that word actually means. Do either of you guys want to take a stab at that?
Jay, care to take a stab? I'm just going to toss that one over to you.
A definition that I have.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. Maybe I have a definition. Let's see. Urbanization can be seen as a specific condition at a set time, e.g., the proportion of total population or area in a city or a town, or it can be seen as an increase in that condition over time. Therefore, urbanization can be quantified either in terms of the level of urban development relative to the overall population, or as the rate at which the urban proportion of the population is increasing.
Cool. Yeah. So I have also a definition that I can read.
Go ahead.
Shouts out to knowing how to read.
It's a big one.
It's a big one.
It's huge.
Mine feels a little less clunky. I don't know. We'll have to compare sources. But it says urbanization is the process by which rural communities grow to form cities or urban centers, and by extension, the growth and expansion of those cities. And I think that gives, in my mind, a good picture of what I see when I think about urbanization, of people moving to the city, of the city growing.
Why do cities grow?
So that's an awesome question. I actually read a lot about that specific reason, but I'm wondering if we can table it, put a pin in that for
Okay. Yeah.
for a moment, and talk a little bit about the world history of urbanization. So urbanization began in ancient Mesopotamia during the Uruk period, 4300 to 3100 BCE. And it's for reasons scholars have not yet agreed upon. So to answer your question, at least in ancient times, Aiden, there is and are arguments about why or why not urbanization started. However, what is clear throughout world history, rather than boring you guys with all of the details, is that urban centers have risen and repeatedly fallen. So it's been really rare for urban centers over world history to survive for long periods of time, largely due to overuse of resources. So
fingers crossed ours,
the
Twin Cities stick around through our lifetimes.
So maybe we figure it out and maybe we don't. But I was fascinated by that piece of information, and wondered what you guys might think about the sustainability of cities.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept that I don't feel like I've heard very often, because I feel like when we usually hear about the fall of great societies, it's because of some sort of internal conflict, or I don't know, like the fall of Rome is a classic one, or just some sort of invasion or whatnot. But it's interesting to think of us as like a locust that comes in and drains all the resources, and then, well, now that's just unlivable. Next area to urbanize and all that good stuff. That's really fascinating. I haven't really thought of it in that light very often. Regarding sustainability, I think definitely we can figure it out. And one of the more promising but really simple and just biological evolutionary things is that as women, well, just people in general, become more educated, they have less kids. So all these, I think we went from a place where child mortality was so high that you had to try to have as many kids as possible, and we kept doing that even past the Industrial Revolution and all that. But now we're seeing, as we become more educated, and as we have our own pursuits and kind of extend this sort of adolescence that we have, this own growing period as individuals, as opposed to just pouring into our progeny at a young age, we have less kids now, right? I think the average, I don't remember what it's around 2 though now. It's getting pretty low, at least in the Western world. And I think that will be really big on sustainability. Obviously, just population growth coming to a stale or stagnating. And then also, since we are doing so many amazing things with science, and that leads into architecture and the ability to build high and low. So I think eventually we'll just like New York and so many places have developed subway systems. It'll just become, and if you've ever been to major cities like that anywhere around the world, it's not just like you go down and you take the subway. It's like, no, there's a whole mall down there. Like there's so much down there, and we'll just keep leveling that off as time goes on. And from my research, it's a much safer, much more sustainable thing to go down than up, because obviously it's just crazy wind shear and gravity and nuts, the crazy things
Yeah.
up in the air. But also even going into like vertical agricultural farming or agriculture and all that type of stuff, where we're not taking up all this land, and as we kind of figure out what we're doing with climate change and the farm, big agriculture, and these cows and all that, and we kind of go more into figuring out that how to make plants more sustainable and take up less land, then we'll just have these whole constructs, I imagine, in the future, where it's simply a farm going up to the sky, and then we'll have whole kind of communities within one building where you can get every single thing that you need just in that one area. And obviously you will branch out, but that's just what it is. So that's how I see us growing into sustainability, and I definitely think we'll figure it out if we don't blow ourselves up in the process.
Wild. Man, you have such a positive outlook. Not to say that mine's so negative, but I struggle to see that future. And maybe it's because I've never lived in an urban center yet. And growing up, we talked about an urban center. We talked about specifically, quote unquote, the cities, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, as a wasteful, democratic. I grew up in a strong Republican home. Wasteful. I mean, did I say that again? Let me say that again. We grew up hearing about these city slickers who were wasting Minnesota's resources, and I think I'm still learning how wrong that was in a lot of ways, because I think there's just such a difference in population that the conception of use of resources was even hard to understand, and I'm still getting my head around it, because growing up, then I had this idea that people in the city didn't care about the environment, or people in the city didn't care for nature. And now that I am more, I think, environmentally conscious than I ever have been, and I'm moving to an urban center, I'm like, oh man, how can I maintain these values in an urban center? Because on the one hand, I could move into a small apartment and be using less space, which is a resource, and I can be conscientious of my water intake and my CO2 and turning off lights and all the things. But by proxy, I'm in an apartment building now, and I know that that also uses more of other resources. So it's been this dance that I've been doing mentally to try to reconcile with my learned idea of what it means to live in an urban center and how wasteful or not it could be. But now what I'm learning is that it could potentially be, like you said, Dre, even more sustainable. But I don't know that there's an answer yet to that question or that idea.
Yeah, so that the points from both of you reminds me a lot of I read this National Geographic that was written, or article that was written by a landscape architect, and it was definitely an optimistic vision for the future, I would say. However, it echoed a lot of what Dre said, and then also addressed a lot of the sustainability concerns that Lauren brought up based on her experiences growing up in rural America, and obviously that's a whole nother topic. But so in that, he describes this vision of these urban centers that are part of these hubs, with kind of like this hub and spoke kind of model, where there are these urban centers that are these hubs that are highly dense, and people are living down and up with vertical farms, green roofs to reduce the effects of excess heat that might come from having concrete around and things of that nature, as well as taking in carbon dioxide. And then those urban centers are connected to each other via like high-speed train or hyperloops or whatever else, some sort of public transit system. And then the wild thought here, that I don't know how the rural communities, how big of a fan they would be, is to return the vast majority of our land. I can't remember the exact numbers proposed, but it was like 70 or 80% to wilderness. And so having humans in these dense centers and then having wilderness was proposed as being one of the more sustainable ways to manage having large numbers of people. Yeah, so I thought that was kind of definitely an optimistic vision for the future. But yeah, also incorporated a lot of what Dre was describing. But then to your point, Lauren, about your experience growing up in a rural community, I think it's no secret that there is an urban and rural divide in America, as well as other countries, and it's been like a historical trend. But I think it's especially like now the power is very focused in these urban centers, and so there is a lot of reason for many rural communities to be just frustrated. So anyways, it just evoked a lot of thoughts in me. But Lauren, as far as your experience goes, how has it been? Have you do you go back to your community and witness any changes as far as attitudes go since you were growing up? Or
well, first I want to respond a bit to what you were just saying and explaining, and then I can talk a little bit more about my experience. My first thought as you were describing the hub and spoke model was of Hunger Games, and I was thinking in my head, I'm like, oh man, that doesn't sound like it will go over well with the rural populations. But maybe, I don't know, and who knows, maybe there could be a way that it would happen really sustainably over time and people would be excited about it. It might make sense even with the amount of population that seems to be flowing still into urban areas, despite what Dre had mentioned earlier, a decrease in the rate that the population seems to be growing in the United States. Now, common scientists, do your research. This crap we're talking about is really complex.
So Dre was saying that the population growth overall is starting to slow down, but the growth of cities relative to the urban population relative to the rural population is growing. So more people from rural areas are moving to urban areas. Yeah.
Isn't that what I just said?
I thought you were having a problem with what Dre said.
No, I was pointing out exactly what you just said. So anyways.
I don't remember saying any of this, so I'm trying to figure out what's going on.
The beauty of the imperfections of language, and we'll get there. Anyways, so urbanization. Okay, so that was my Hunger Games comment, my tangent of the Lauren who loves to read novels for teenagers. And then to respond to your question, Aiden, I don't know that my rural communities perception or perspective has changed, but I'm not very plugged in to my rural community. I didn't have a super great experience with the rural community in some ways, and so once I found myself outside of that, I was really excited to just be diving in and fully engaged with my larger community and building my own world and life. And I think that made my own perception change a lot of what urbanization means, of what it means to be a quote-unquote city slicker. But I don't know that my community back home feels so differently now. But again, I'm not very plugged into that community, so I certainly cannot speak on their behalf. And I did have a awesome experiences in some areas for sure. So I don't want to discount rural living because it also enabled me to have awesome relationships with my teachers and business owners and things of that nature. But it was limiting in some ways, especially for the vision that I saw in the world. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the pros of rural living?
I think that my house back home has the best water, like tasting most fresh, clean water in the world. And actually, it might be like a little true. Let me explain. We had a ground well of our own, and so this is something that people in the city are probably less familiar with because I think you all drink city water. But yeah, we had our own like well, which had just water tapped into like groundwater, and the lake that I grew up on is the second or third clearest lake in the state of Minnesota, and Minnesota also has an abundance of lakes, and I think we call it the land of 10,000 lakes, right? But I think in just my county alone that I grew up in, there were 10,000 lakes. So, and I can double check the numbers, but
no, that's not true.
Like,
that's not true.
Are you sure?
Yeah, there's no way. Minnesota has like 11,000 lakes or something.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna check to see how far I was off, but
you were off.
well, that's good to call me out. Okay, so clearly not 10,000, way inflated, but still 378
magnitudes.
Magnitudes, okay.
Magnitude's different.
In the mind of someone who's just
Still
driving around, like running into lakes.
No, I feel you. Probably, you probably got it ingrained like as a kid. You're like, man, there's a lake at every corner. I bet you there's 10,000 just in my city. This is the county of 10,000 lakes. It's all good. I feel you.
God, I'm really glad you called me out. Definitely not 10,000, but it just seemed like you're probably so right that growing up I was like, there are so many lakes.
Yeah.
So many lakes. So, but 378 in Becker County, so that's a lot.
It is a lot of lakes.
A lot of lakes. So I would say those are my...
Common sciences is valuable to have friends around to call you on your crops.
Oh, for sure. Yes. So, anyways, the 378 lakes... not 10,000. Those were definitely a positive of rural living. And then I think too, being able to get out of the town, which was a tiny town, but to go home and be home and away from the world, it felt was sometimes and is still when I get to visit home one of my favorite things about having a rural place to call home still, at least a childhood home.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you didn't go into it because of the 10,000 lakes thing, but you were starting to talk about the actual science behind water quality. I think that's what you alluded to.
Yeah, so the main piece of it being that like groundwater and being able to tap into fresh groundwater, that's not in a reserve but is flowing. So we had underwater flowing water.
Yeah, it's not still.
Right, is
growing bacteria and all that.
Yeah, is cleaner through some, well, I don't want to say cleaner because city water is cleaned also. It's just different because it's like naturally cleaned, and then you can also add your own filtration. Yeah.
And there's a different taste to it,
right,
for sure.
Right, for sure.
Yeah,
so.
Whenever I went out to the suburbs, like Grant County and stuff like that, you guys had some sort of different water, and I was just like, this is so stinky and weird. Like every time I washed my hands, I was like, what does that smell? Like, who's in here like tooting? Like, which is probably just like, I'm sure it's something in the water, but it could be too like natural gases or something like being attached to like running down the same kind of, I don't know shit about groundwater, but something down there with it. I don't know, but it was so stinky to me. I always go back to, because even like I lived in Matamidi for like middle school, high school age. But even that was like really close to the cities, so I don't think our water really tasted like when I moved from the inner cities. I don't remember there being a big shift there. But then when I went out into like the farther out, I don't know, like you said, I don't know if you call those suburbs or what you would call some of those farm areas.
Yeah.
But I was like, this water is very stinky and not good at all. And I would be like, and even too, like you guys, I always associate it with like being wealthy. But now I'm seeing like you guys also kind of needed like the water that comes out of the fridge and the extra like spout that people would have out in those areas. Where it's like we never had those. We just drink out the tap and it didn't really taste. I'm sure to you specifically, Lauren, it would have tasted much different. But for me, I grew up on city water. Go to Matamidi, kind of the same, but then go out a little bit farther and it's like this water is not good. This something that was not filtered.
I'm sure many people who have traveled at least have had that experience where you try someone else's water and you're like, what is this?
At the Minnesota State Fair, which I think is the largest state fair by daily attendance, at least
I think so. In the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah, they had this water tasting bar at one of the exhibits where they had water from Duluth, Minnesota, and water from all these different areas in Minnesota. Duluth's tasted nice, I gotta say.
Duluth has some good water.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, like here, all those sturgeon and lamprey,
even with but yeah, all this conversation of water just makes me think too of where cities arise and some of the biggest challenges that cities have faced. So you look at a map, cities tend to be by a body of water, a river or a lake. That's because we need water to live. Like we need to drink it, so might as well settle pretty darn close to it, as well as to grow food and other things. So yeah, it's kind of amazing. Just you look at any city or town, even there, it's almost guaranteed to be on at least a little stream.
Yeah, yeah. I bet you do you know what the percentage of capital cities that are on a river? I bet you it's like crazy high.
I have no idea.
Okay, I don't know. I'm just throwing a number, but I bet you it's like 85 at least.
It's not 10,000.
It's not 10,000%. I mean, it's not 10,000%. That's accurate. But sorry, go ahead, Aiden.
Yeah, just I mean, I think about anyone that I can think about: Minneapolis, St. Paul on a river, London, River Thames. Anyone that I think of at least is on a river or a lake.
Especially some of those more those older ones, more ancient ones, are always going to be on like some sort of Ganges or Nile or something like that.
Right,
for sure. Rhine, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I think to get to the idea a little bit about what brings people to an urban center, why urbanization happens, is often talked about like being jobs and prosperity and access to resources, that there are just a lot of pull factors into the city areas. Does that resonate with you guys at all?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think about like your conversation and your personal experience about having a Walmart 45 minutes away. There's something to be said about being able to spread the cost amongst a lot of people and be able to diversify responsibility.
Yeah, no question. It's definitely, like you said, you could either break it down to either resources or opportunity, whichever word you want to use. But it's definitely, that's what it's all about. And like you take now obviously the world is much more connected, and whether it be just via the internet, whether it be Amazon delivering anywhere, whether it be Walmart being in every small bum F, except for you, apparently it was 30 minutes away, you said?
I think 40
minutes away.
I don't know. It depends how fast you drive.
Yeah, but essentially Walmarts are pretty much everywhere. But I think going back to that, I feel like that should be like a recognized standard unit. It's like, how far away are you from a Walmart? That should be something standardized and codified.
Yeah,
for sure.
So when I applied for medical school the first time, they want you to classify your living, and you can designate yourself as having grown up in a medically underserved community.
Yeah.
And you have to justify it. You have to write out like 300 characters or 500 characters, whatever it is, to justify why. And there aren't a ton of metrics. You can look up what a rural or an isolated population is considered, and of course where I grew up was considered isolated.
Mm-hmm.
But justifying being medically underserved is much harder, despite for me knowing that some of the clinicians that I might see rotated between maybe 100 miles of several different clinics that they saw and were never there full time at each clinic. So that's just one example. And then the other example of my mom having to drive about an hour to give birth to the last 4 of us kids. So I think that's another fascinating thing. When you said the Walmart thing, I'm like, man, yeah, there aren't a lot of metrics for, and maybe there are, but maybe not so standardized, it doesn't seem, to talk about that. Like, how far are you from the nearest Walmart? Or like, how far are you from this care that you could receive?
Definitely. And I think with whether urbanization, how long it will continue, I think by 2100 it's supposed to go from like 50% of the population to like 70% of the world's population or something like that will be in urban areas. But thinking about how there are, we all, because we're all at least, we either have spent a significant amount of time in the cities, or we know people, like we have close friends that grew up in the cities. And obviously with the internet, with social media, like the world is so connected that you're going to see, like you can be exposed to pretty much anything in the world and feel like you understand it, even if you haven't experienced it. And where I'm going with that is that we all know somebody who was raised in the cities who's ready to get out and like find some space and find some acreage and find some quiet. And that's a real thing. And one of the reasons why I feel that that might become more common is simply because of social media and because of Amazon and because of the ability to work remotely. It's just that you don't need all these resources. These resources are now remote. These resources can now come to you. You don't have to drive 150 miles to the nearest hospital or anything like that in 2021. So we might see a little bit of that dip, a little bit of that reverse, and that makes a lot of sense because with urbanization comes pestilence, overcrowding, for especially historically, well, it still happens today for sure, around the world for sure, but even in America, like obligatory migration into cities happens, and that's how you force people into slums and all this type of stuff. So there's all these things, and there's obviously environmental factors such as the pollution that cities create, the urban heat
Air
islands.
quality.
Yeah, so I read
Islands,
a National Geographic article called Urban Threat, and they say that 2 of the most pressing problems facing the world today come together in urban centers, 1 being poverty and 2 being environmental degradation. And they go on to explain that to generally mean poor air and water quality, insufficient water availability, waste disposal problems, and high energy consumption that exacerbate or that are exacerbated by the increasing population density and demands of that urban center. So,
and another just
spot on.
To add to, that's kind of something that's thought about less is I think it was Houston. One of the reasons why there was so much issue with the hurricane was because there were a lot of wetlands originally, but then they paved over them, and so there wasn't as much availability for drainage. Like the water gets stuck on the concrete, right, and then it can't go anywhere. So that was another issue with the concrete jungle.
Speaking of Houston, this seems like a good moment to throw in that actually Texas has the largest state fair at 225 million people visiting. Minnesota's is second at 200 million.
You looked it up.
Or 2 million.
I think Minnesota's the largest by daily attendance, though. So
according to readers.com blog, biggest state fairs, that's not true, but obviously readers.com blog could certainly be wrong, but they say the State Fair of Texas comes in at 2.25 million visitors, and Minnesota is 2 million visitors
a day.
I don't know, probably total, but I didn't read the article.
Okay.
I googled it.
Yeah, I mean, Texas. I'm sure we were the biggest for a while, and then Texas was just like, well, we're Texas, so here we go. But yeah, I don't. Even to that point about the marshlands and all that, because you have the desert over in Arizona too, where they're running out of like whatever is groundwater or underground wells, or I can't remember what their water, what's it called? Watershed? No, not watershed.
There's aquifers.
Aquifers, yeah, I think that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, so all those are kind of like being run dry.
Yeah, underground.
All that. So that's obviously a huge issue. And yeah, I mean, there's just a ton of issues with urbanization, but I think a lot of them are more so because of negligence, which we see as well with fossil fuels and the like, than it is we cannot sustain what we currently have, or like, like it's not possible. And I don't know. So I'm optimistic at the possibility. I'm not as optimistic about the probability, because I'm hoping humans will end up doing the right thing. But obviously in a society like ours
of building sustainability,
correct.
Okay.
We are constantly chasing the dollar, and that is, I mean, that's going to lead to exploitation of something that's, whether it's animals, the environment, other people. And that goes back to your guys' points about poverty, how urbanization creates poverty, because people in the rural areas are a lot of times really, really poor, but they have a communal living. First of all, their prices are way down, right? They don't pay as much for anything, but then also they have communal living. So people in the area take care of them. Like, you're not going to see homeless people because everybody knows that guy. Like, oh, we're going to bring him in. But urbanization creates a very competitive mentality where every single person, whether you guys like, I don't even know like my neighbors in my apartment building. Like, I know a couple of them, but like there's I don't know, 100 people that live in that building. I probably know 3. And it's just like, and I said, and then the same thing with like your whatever workforce you're working, like you see everybody's competition, and in a way you are all competing for, like you said, like it's a ton of resources piled into one area, but because of exploitation, essentially, there isn't enough for everybody, because one person has $1 billion and one person has negative 5,000.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to date the cast, but in this period of time after COVID, we've been having a lot of open jobs, and I think this speaks straight to what you just said. I have applied for, I think, 16 now jobs in the Minneapolis Twin Cities area. And I know the process takes time, and it's only been maybe a month and a half or so, maybe 2 months, but I haven't heard a yes from anyone, right? Like, there is a lot of competition, while we say or have this idea that it's more prosperous and more job ridden. It just isn't necessarily the case, especially if you're having like, oh, I want to work in a specific area or at a specific thing. So
yeah,
I think that's just consequence of the urban area.
Yeah, and I think to one of the things, so some obviously competition is real, like that's how we became who we are today,
right? And
became top of the food chain. All that stuff is through competition with each other, intra competition, but also inter with other species, etc., in our own environment. But I think a lot of it is just created, right? A lot of it is just fabricated from people at the top that want you to work harder or run this rat race and all that type of stuff. And that's very natural, right? Because sports is a fabricated competition, right? It's this whole industry, this whole thing we've been doing for thousands of years, because it's who we are, to compete, that seems like a better, more pure form of competition than the kind of pinning neighbors against each other and making people fight for scraps of food. And I think as we evolve into a more empathetic society and culture as a globe, we'll have social programs in place so that you don't need to fight for your life. Like, you might still need to compete to live your dream, or to like have your dream job or career, or have the honorifics that you want or anything like that, but just to survive and live a good life, you won't have to compete in that matter, and you won't be kind of brainwashed or funneled into a pipeline of people where you go $80,000 in debt, and now you have all this financial burden, so that it's like, of course I have to be that 1 out of 10,000 people that gets into this school and gets this job because I just went $100,000 in debt to get this opportunity.
Right. Yeah, I think so. 2 things that as far as the competition goes, I do think one benefit that it has had is driving prices incredibly low, and through the internet. the ability to learn is incredibly cheap now outside of higher education, obviously. And so like I do think there can be a lot more opportunity if there is a shift in our society as far as living a meaningful life for less money. But then beyond that too, as far as cooperation goes, one thing that you made me think of as far as this transition towards a more empathetic society was, I think it was Nikola Tesla who thought that the future of humanity is one in which queen bees ruled the roost, where women were in charge and leading things like cities, organizations like cities. And one thing that, I mean, I have no idea, I have not looked into it. It might be something to look into as far as a hypothesis goes, but I do think that there is something with men in general, or on average, where they tend to be more aggressive and more competition oriented, whereas women, in my personal experience, and so this is my hypothesis, but do your research, common scientists, that women tend to be more oriented at cooperation and bringing people together, and that's only my observation, but I mean, maybe there's some truth in that as far as the transitioning to a more empathetic society goes.
I would say that could be true. I do have kind of a case study in my research. I was looking into sustainability, and my first thought was, oh crap, I'm seeing all of this National Geographic type stuff that's saying that cities aren't sustainable, and I am moving to one. So I wanted to see what the cities were saying about cities, right? Like, what do they have to say about the sustainability? And so I looked a little bit into Minneapolis city planning and St. Paul city planning, and I just at random chose a project in the urban planning section of the Minneapolis site and came across 38th Street Thrive. Have you heard of it, Dre?
No.
38th Street Thrive, Aiden?
No.
Okay, so in Minneapolis, there was a horrific event that took place on May 25th of 2020. I think a lot of people will remember the George Floyd event for years to come. I hope it's not forgotten. And at random, I just chose to look into this urban planning. While I'm familiar with the George Floyd event, I didn't remember 38th Street. And it's a whole plan to revitalize using already existing strengths in that community, that community's rich history. They call it the soul of the city, this historically Black community in Minneapolis. And a woman is in charge of sort of this project. So to speak to your ideas about Aiden, maybe female leadership, and Dre, maybe more empathy, being involved in planning where people don't have to fight for just like a life, right? And yeah, I was amazed paging through this 38th Street Thrive plan. The city plan is publicly available, how much complexity goes into just one small area of the city. Now, this is a really critical area in Minneapolis, especially considering what happened in 2020, but it's amazingly complex.
Oh yeah, it's insane. I actually, when I went through my quarter life crisis, interviewed an urban planner, and she had said that it's incredibly rewarding. Projects take an incredibly long amount of time, and and you will inevitably be the bad guy to someone, because I mean, you think about trying to move or do anything within an urban environment where there's, I mean, just hundreds of millions of people of all sorts of backgrounds and interests in mind. But it is amazing that like through all of these individual projects emerges these complex systems that are cities.
Right. And we hope, right, that they will continue to work forward each of these individual efforts to create a more equitable, more easily sustainable society, and certainly a more sustainable urban center.
Yeah, I agree. In order to do this in urban areas, in cities, and what's kind of underlying everything that you guys are talking about with those last two examples, which first of all, yeah, very cool what they're doing. When you said 38th, I imagine it must have been like, 38th in Chicago, that area, Powderhorn and all that. But I was like, 38th Drive, I haven't really heard that. But that's really cool. And I think to both of your points, I think there is like definitely an evolutionary and just like a psychological and cultural, all that mixed in tendency for women to take on these tasks. And it would be interesting to see some more kind of societies led by women. One of the issues I think with that is, though, women who, I don't know how many matriarchs there are or how many like prime ministers or whatever have been female throughout human history, but I don't think that those societies have necessarily, unless maybe New Zealand. I've heard a lot of good things about them, but
New Zealand's doing well.
Yeah,
they
but
tamped out the COVID crisis.
Yeah,
real quick.
Yeah, so they're doing a lot of amazing things with social reform and social kind of social programs, socialism, all that type of stuff, which is, I don't know much about New Zealand. Maybe it's in part a product to them having a female leader. I'm not quite sure, but I don't think for most societies they've really changed too much in empathy just because they had a female leader. Like even a couple years, like 10 years ago, if I would have heard that Hillary Clinton, which I think she did run for president, right? She ran against Barack. So if I heard that, yeah, I might like kind of be excited for that, because I'm like, oh yeah, like a woman in power. Like I was raised by 3 women actually, et cetera, et cetera. Like I have a admiration for their what appears to be, and what I think a lot of studies have shown, their desire to be collaborative as opposed to competitive, empathetic, and to value kind of those type of traits as opposed to simply valuing ambition and sales and this kind of task oriented things that men and patriarchs have historically valued. But then once I see Hillary Clinton go against Bernie in 2016, I can see what type of, which I don't know how she is as a person, but I can see how her personality is and kind of what her policies are and how she got to where she is, So it's like you're still working within a historically patriarchal human species. So it's like to get to these points, so many of those kind of things that we might consider feminine have kind of been weeded out throughout the years, if that makes sense. And feel free to push back on that at all. But that's just kind of how I've seen it. And I'm just like, I don't exactly know how. It's kind of like the classic question, like how do you expect to change the system within the system? And like that's kind of where we run and beat our heads against the wall. So I don't know what makes New Zealand special. Obviously something smaller, like you're saying, we're just taking one neighborhood. Of course that level of empathy can shine because you're in an actual community, and that's one of the biggest problems with urbanization is a lack of community. Like I said, my apartment complex, when the George Floyd stuff happened, we did become more of a community because it was just right down the street from us, which was really cool to see, and a lot of us did become quote unquote friends. We were bonded by a similar kind of fear and strife and fight that a lot of us were going through at that time, which was awesome. But in general, urbanization, it's like like that person next to you doesn't have your last name. They're not blood related to you. A lot of them don't look like you. They don't have the same teacher as you. They don't have the same master or sensei, vocational leader, whatever as you. So you have no commonality other than you live right next to each other. And that's a huge problem. So if somehow we can figure out how to make everybody in the state, in the city, in America, in the world feel like one common thing, then we could have a global community.
I hear you. That are you either of you familiar with Dunbar's number? Okay.
Go ahead.
So to keep it brief, it's just he's a cognitive psychologist who hypothesized that people can only keep track of like up to 150 people.
Gotcha.
In terms of their relationships, names, their backgrounds, all those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, to what you're saying, how we've kind of overcome that is by having something bigger than us to believe in, and something, just bigger than us to believe in. And I think, moving the needle towards more of this global community, like we are all human, kind of from my humanist perspective, but like we are all like one species trying to survive. Like having that sort of mentality can help move people away from kind of the tribalism of today. But yeah, I think that's super true, that it is incredibly important that we need to have some unified story where we can move forward together and cooperate together.
A unified story, I like that. And Dre, I think what you said was spoken quite eloquently, that in some ways, and now I'm paraphrasing, but in some ways we seem to live in a more isolated society than ever, despite being in a more urban situation than ever, at least in Minnesota for sure. And I hope that can be reconciled both at an individual level, then also at a human and society level of humanness and of a global population. And then finally, of course, for the environment, so that what we can be building is sustainable. And I think I would have to do more research for sure, specifically to look into female leadership and how that's affect societies. I'm just not familiar enough. You said you can push back. Well, I don't feel like I don't have any grounds to push back, but that might be another interesting topic for a future cast. Needless to say, though, that I think we have talked about vision on both ends, some really positive vision for urban centers, some major problems for urban centers and problems due to urbanization. But I think this cast, more than anything for me, just isn't going to encourage me to think more critically about my move to the cities and what that means for my community and how I might be a more engaged person who lives in an urban center. I don't know if you guys resonate with any of that.
Oh yeah, like any common science episode, it only raises more questions and excites me more to learn more.
Absolutely, but good to ask questions today about urbanization and learn with each other a little bit about what urbanization means for the world, what it means for us as individuals, and what it might mean for your community at home as a common scientist.
Hey Common Scientists, hope you enjoyed the cast. Thanks for investing in common science. We hope it brought as much value to you as it did to us.
To learn more, smash the subscribe button and visit our website, commonscientists.com, where you can read our blog, join our email newsletter, and follow us on social media.
Finally, if you like what we have to say, you can absolutely support us on Patreon. We could always use more support. You can navigate there also from our website, commonscientists.com, common scientists with an S, so that we can continue cultivating a community of common scientists.